Welcome to Mill History Talk, the podcast where strategy meets storytelling, unpacking the drama, decisions, and disasters of war so you understand not just what happened, but why it still matters. The views expressed on Mill History Talk are those of the hosts, writers, and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any government agency, military organization, or institution. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. Welcome to episode 77 of Mill History Talk, where history is not dusty. It is strategy, drama, human endurance, and occasionally a very large cargo ship moving 11 knots while an entire ocean tries to kill it. I'm Hope.
And I'm Brian.
Today we are talking about the United States Merchant Marine in the Second World War, the civilian sailors and commercial ships that carried American power across the oceans. And yes, Brian, I said logistics voluntarily.
I knew you would eventually come around.
I have always respected logistics.
You once described a supply table as the part of the book where hope goes to die.
Lowercase hope. Completely different hope. But this episode really is the perfect companion to our last two major naval discussions. In episode 76, we examined the American submarine campaign against Japan. American submarines attacked Japan's merchant fleet, strangled its economy, disrupted its military supply system, and helped isolate an island empire from the resources it needed to continue fighting. Today, we look at the opposite side of that equation. Instead of destroying an enemy's maritime logistics, the United States had to build, protect, organize, and operate its own.
Episode 76 was about how a nation can be defeated when its merchant shipping collapses. Episode 77 is about how a nation projects power when its merchant shipping succeeds.
And episode 74 gave us the intellectual framework. Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that sea power was not simply a matter of battleships. It also rested on commerce, shipping, overseas access, maritime infrastructure, and the national capacity to use the sea. The merchant marine was one of the clearest demonstrations of that idea in American history.
A battle fleet could protect sea lanes and defeat enemy naval forces, but it could not, by itself, carry millions of soldiers, tanks, locomotives, ammunition, food, aircraft parts, bulldozers, and barrels of fuel around the world. For that, the United States needed merchant ships.
A lot of merchant ships. The story begins with an uncomfortable fact. The United States entered the 1930s as a maritime nation with a badly aging merchant fleet. After the First World War, America possessed one of the largest and most modern commercial fleets in the world, but the post-war shipping market collapsed. Ships were sold, commercial demand declined, and companies delayed replacing aging vessels. By the Great Depression, more than 90% of the American commercial fleet was over 20 years old.
Many of those vessels could manage only about 10 or 11 knots. That was acceptable for routine peacetime commerce. It was a serious strategic weakness for a country that might need to support military operations across two enormous oceans.
10 knots is not exactly maritime urgency. That is less racing toward victory and more, your package has left the distribution center and may arrive sometime next month.
Assuming it is not torpedoed off Cape Hatteras.
And there goes our sponsorship from the shipping industry. Congress finally acted with the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. The law created the United States Maritime Commission and declared that the country needed a merchant fleet capable of supporting national defense during war or emergency. That is an important change in thinking. Merchant shipping was no longer treated solely as private business. It was recognized as strategic infrastructure. The 1936 law also supplied the federal foundation for a much larger maritime training system, but the United States Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point emerged in stages rather than appearing fully formed in a single act of Congress.
The United States Merchant Marine Cadet Corps began in 1938. Training initially took place aboard ships and at temporary facilities. After the United States entered the war, the government acquired the permanent campus at Kings Point, New York, and President Franklin Roosevelt formally dedicated the academy in September 1943.
And Kings Point was not a quiet college safely observing the war from Long Island. Its midshipmen completed sea training aboard working merchant ships sailing into combat zones. 142 cadet midshipmen were killed during the war. The academy remains the only federal service academy authorized to carry a battle standard, commemorating the wartime service of its students.
Its purpose then was straightforward: produce licensed deck and engineering officers for a merchant fleet that had to sustain a global war. Its mission today remains closely connected to that original requirement. Kings Point educates licensed merchant marine officers and commissioned officers who serve the national security, marine transportation, and economic needs of the United States. Graduates normally earn a bachelor's degree, an unlimited Coast Guard officer license, and a military commission.
So it is part maritime college, part federal service academy, and part national insurance policy for the moment when someone discovers that an overseas military still requires ships, crews, and people who know how to operate both.
Graduates generally owe 5 years of approved maritime or active duty service, maintain their professional license for at least 6 years, and hold a reserve commission for at least 8 years. Many serve as strategic sealift officers in the Navy Reserve, supporting emergency crewing and shoreside sealift operations.
In other words, Kings Point connects the wartime lesson of 1942 to the strategic requirements of the present. Merchant shipping is national power only when trained people are ready to sail it.
The government used subsidies to offset the higher cost of building and operating ships in the United States. It also began a long-range program to replace the aging First World War fleet. The original goal was 500 new vessels over 10 years. As war approached, those numbers rose dramatically.
The government also created the United States Maritime Service to train the people who would sail those ships. Because, and this will shock absolutely no one who has ever watched a government procurement program, a ship without a trained crew is just an extremely expensive steel parking lot.
The pre-war programs mattered because shipyards, designs, contracts, and training systems were already developing before Pearl Harbor. The United States was not ready in December 1941, but it was far better positioned than it would have been without the reforms begun 5 years earlier.
And there is a larger strategic lesson here. You cannot improvise maritime power after the crisis starts. You can accelerate production. You can simplify designs. You can work 3 shifts. But shipyards, skilled labor, port facilities, training systems, and commercial shipping networks take years to develop. Mahan would have recognized the point immediately. Sea power begins long before the fleet sails.
After the United States entered the war, the shipping problem became enormous. The Army needed transports, the Navy needed auxiliaries. Britain and the Soviet Union needed Lend-Lease supplies. American forces had to be deployed and sustained in Europe, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, Alaska, India, and dozens of supporting bases. There were never enough ships to meet every demand.
So the United States did what the United States often does when confronted with an impossible industrial problem. It built something simple, standardized it, and then produced an absolutely unreasonable number of them. Enter the Liberty ship.
Liberty ships were slow cargo vessels of roughly 10,800 deadweight tons. They were based on a British design and were not technologically sophisticated. But sophistication was not the principal requirement. They had to be inexpensive, reliable, and fast to produce.
The Liberty ship was not the sports car of the Atlantic. It was a delivery van with a large cargo hold, a defensive gun, and the strong possibility of being attacked by a German submarine.
By wartime standards, that was enough. American shipyards used prefabrication, welding, standardized components, and repetitive production methods. Sections of a ship could be manufactured separately and then assembled in the yard. New facilities were constructed, workers were trained, and jobs once confined to specialized trades were broken into repeatable industrial tasks.
Women entered shipyards in large numbers. So did African American workers, migrants, farmers, mechanics, and people who had never seen an ocean before being hired to build ships for one. The shipbuilding program became a national mobilization effort, and it was not always smooth. There were labor shortages, steel shortages, equipment shortages, disputes among agencies, changing production requirements, and all the friction that Clausewitz
There it is.
would have expected from any giant human organization trying to reorganize itself during a global emergency.
The Maritime Commission managed construction, but building ships did not answer the question of who would control them or determine where they sailed. In February 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt created the War Shipping Administration. The WSA controlled or allocated much of the American merchant fleet. It requisitioned and chartered vessels, coordinated repairs and conversions, assigned ships among military and civilian requirements, helped provide crews, and supervised many aspects of loading, routing, and port operations.
In other words, the government turned commercial shipping into a national transportation pool. Private companies still operated many vessels, but the ships no longer sailed according to normal market demand. They sailed according to strategy.
Shipping became one of the principal constraints on Allied operations. Commanders could propose invasions, offensives, and deployments, but if the ships did not exist, those plans could not happen.
This is the moment where every operations officer slowly looks toward the logistics staff and says, "So, how much can we actually move?"
Usually after the operations officer has already designed a campaign requiring twice the available shipping.
A military tradition Brian assures me remains alive and well. The ships were commercial vessels, and most of the people sailing them were civilians, but there was nothing remotely safe or ordinary about their work. German submarines understood exactly what merchant shipping represented. Every freighter destroyed meant fewer tanks, fewer trucks, fewer aircraft engines, less ammunition, and less food reaching Allied forces.
The merchant ship was not a secondary target. It was often the reason the U-boat was at sea. When Germany launched its submarine offensive along the American East Coast in early 1942, merchant mariners suffered heavily. Coastal cities remained illuminated. Convoy organization was incomplete. Air coverage was inadequate. Many ships sailed independently. German submarines found vulnerable targets close to American shores.
This was the period the Germans called the Second Happy Time. It was considerably less happy for the people on the tankers and freighters.
Merchant crews sailed despite the danger because the cargo still had to move. Over time, the United States adopted more effective convoys, expanded air patrols, improved anti-submarine warfare, exploited intelligence, and organized escort groups. Merchant vessels sailed in formations, maintained station, followed routing orders, observed blackout procedures, and relied on naval escorts to protect them.
And many carried Navy armed guard detachments. These were naval gun crews assigned to merchant ships to operate defensive weapons against aircraft, surfaced submarines, and other threats. The arrangement captured the unusual character of merchant service during the war. Civilian captains and sailors operated the ships. Navy personnel helped defend them. Everyone aboard faced the same torpedoes, bombs, mines, fires, freezing water, and explosions.
The Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union were among the most dangerous voyages. Ships sailed around German-occupied Norway toward Murmansk and Archangel. They faced submarines, Luftwaffe aircraft, surface ships, extreme cold, ice, violent seas, and very limited daylight, or constant daylight depending on the season.
Even reaching port did not necessarily end the danger. Ships could be bombed while unloading. The Arctic route was basically the ocean announcing, "The enemy may not kill you, but I would like an opportunity."
Merchant ships also supported the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. They carried troops, fuel, ammunition, engineering equipment, vehicles, and food into waters threatened by mines, aircraft, submarines, and shore attack. In the Pacific, merchant crews operated across vast distances and sometimes came under air attack, artillery fire, and kamikaze attack.
During the liberation of the Philippines, some merchant crews were forced to abandon damaged or dangerously exposed ships and take shelter in foxholes ashore. That is not what most people picture when they hear the phrase civilian merchant sailor.
The human cost was severe. By VJ Day, 733 American merchant vessels larger than 1,000 gross tons had been lost to torpedoes, bombs, mines, and wartime marine disasters. The War Shipping Administration recorded 5,638 merchant officers and seamen dead or missing, and 581 taken prisoner.
Those figures deserve a moment. These were men who repeatedly sailed into combat zones without the public recognition normally given to members of the armed forces. They did not storm beaches or fly bombing missions. They carried the material that allowed someone else to do those things.
And the enemy attacked them precisely because their work mattered.
The scale of what the Merchant Marine accomplished is difficult to visualize. Between Pearl Harbor and the surrender of Japan, more than 268 million long tons of cargo were shipped from the United States. That included over 203 million tons of dry cargo and almost 65 million tons of petroleum and other bulk liquids.
The cargo went to nearly every major theater. It included tanks, trucks, locomotives, aircraft components, hospital supplies, construction material, landing craft, food, ammunition, explosives, and petroleum. Shipping also brought strategic raw materials back to the United States, feeding the industrial system that produced more wartime cargo.
So, the Merchant Marine was not merely a one-way conveyor belt from American factories to overseas armies. It was a global circulatory system. Ships carried weapons out, brought raw materials back, moved between theaters, supported allies, and sustained the industrial economy at home.
The available shipping shaped Allied strategy. In 1942, the Allies did not possess sufficient lift to launch a major cross-channel invasion with an adequate force and sustain it. Shipping commitments to the Soviet Union, North Africa, the Pacific, and other theaters imposed difficult choices. By late 1943 and 1944, increased ship construction and improved control of the Atlantic made larger operations possible.
Operation Overlord was not simply the story of what happened on the Normandy beaches. Before D-Day, merchant shipping helped move hundreds of thousands of American troops and millions of tons of equipment to Britain. After the landings, ships repeatedly crossed the channel carrying reinforcements and supplies. The invasion did not succeed merely because troops reached France. It succeeded because more troops, fuel, ammunition, trucks, food, medical supplies, and engineering equipment kept arriving after them.
A landing creates a foothold. Logistics turns the foothold into a campaign.
And logistics aboard a merchant ship had its own very practical difficulties. Cargo had to be loaded in the correct sequence. Ports had limited capacity. Ships had to be routed, unloaded, repaired, refueled, and sent back into circulation. A tank loaded beneath thousands of tons of less urgent cargo might exist on paper, but it was not available to a commander who needed it immediately.
This is why shipping management mattered almost as much as ship construction. The United States had to build hulls, crew them, assign them, protect them, load them intelligently, and move them through ports efficiently. Failure anywhere in that chain reduced combat power overseas.
The Pacific made the same point across even greater distances. Island-hopping campaigns required constant maritime movement. Every newly captured island needed food, fuel, ammunition, airfield equipment, construction machinery, replacement troops, and medical support. Then, that island became a base for the next advance.
Naval combat opened the route. Merchant shipping made continued advance possible.
This brings us back to the contrast with Episode 76. American submarines succeeded against Japan because they destroyed the ships connecting the Japanese home islands to the resources of the empire. Oil, ore, food, military supplies, and reinforcements stopped moving in sufficient quantities. Japan could possess factories, soldiers, aircraft, and plans, but without shipping, those assets became increasingly isolated.
The United States avoided that fate because it combined several forms of maritime power. It had industrial capacity to build replacement ships. It had the administrative capacity to allocate them. It had trained civilian mariners willing to sail them. It had naval and air forces capable of protecting the sea lanes. And it had ports, shipyards, fuel supplies, and commercial shipping expertise developed before and during the war.
Japan lost the shipping war because American submarines sank ships faster than Japan could replace and protect them. The Allies won the Atlantic Shipping War because they eventually built and protected ships faster than Germany could destroy them.
That difference converted economic potential into military power.
Or, to put it another way, production statistics do not win wars by themselves. A tank in Detroit is not combat power. A truck parked in California is not combat power in the Philippines. A barrel of fuel in Texas is not combat power anywhere, except possibly a very alarming warehouse fire.
The cargo becomes military power only when a transportation system delivers it to the force that needs it.
And that returns us to episode 74 and Alfred Thayer Mahan. Mahan is usually remembered as the prophet of the decisive battle fleet. Big ships, concentrated fleets, command of the sea. All very dramatic, extremely good material for paintings. But Mahan's theory was broader than battleships.
He connected sea power to geography, commerce, national industry, maritime culture, overseas access, naval strength, and government policy. A powerful navy without a commercial maritime system would possess only part of sea power.
The Second World War proved that point. The Navy could defeat U-boats and protect convoys, but it could not replace the merchant marine. Shipyards could produce Liberty ships, but steel hulls accomplished nothing without crews. Factories could produce weapons, but those weapons accomplished nothing overseas without ports and shipping. Government policy had to connect every element.
The merchant marine was where national economic power, industrial power, naval power, and military strategy met. It was Mahan's idea of national sea power expressed not in a battle line, but in convoys, cargo manifests, shipyards, fuel terminals, and civilian crews.
Which is admittedly less visually dramatic than battleships firing broadsides.
But considerably more useful when the Army asks where its ammunition is.
There is Brian's love language again.
Ammunition arriving on schedule?
I was going to say properly organized bookshelves, but yes. The United States Merchant Marine did not win the Second World War by itself. Its success depended on naval escorts, air patrols, intelligence, shipyards, ports, the Army Transportation Corps, Allied dock workers, and thousands of other organizations. But the Merchant Marine made American power usable at global distance. Its crews carried the war through the Atlantic, the Arctic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific. They sailed into submarine zones, air attack, mines, storms, ice, and enemy-controlled waters. They carried the supplies that sustained Britain and the Soviet Union, built American forces overseas, supported Normandy, and enabled the advance across the Pacific.
Their contribution was not one dramatic action. It was repeated movement. Load, sail, survive, unload, return, and sail again. That repetition created strategic endurance. And perhaps that is why their story has often received less attention. There is no single merchant marine battle that symbolizes the entire war. There are thousands of voyages, thousands of cargo holds, thousands of crews doing necessary work in dangerous places. Military history often remembers the force at the point of contact. It should also remember the people who made sure that force arrived equipped, fueled, and fed.
So, episode 76 showed us how destroying merchant shipping helped defeat Japan. Episode 77 shows us how preserving and expanding merchant shipping helped the Allies win a global war. And episode 74 reminds us that Mahan's sea power was never only about warships. It was about the capacity of a nation to use the oceans for national purpose.
For listeners who want to explore the subject further, two useful starting points are Frederick Lane's Ships for Victory, a major history of wartime shipbuilding under the Maritime Commission, and Jason Stewart's Bridge of Steel, which examines merchant shipping as a strategic component of the Allied war effort.
You can also follow Mill History Talk on Facebook and check the episode notes for a link to our Substack page, where we will have additional material on Liberty ships, merchant mariners, and the maritime logistics that made Allied victory possible. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. We also did a pretty nice little set of episodes on shipbuilding and mobilization for war back in episodes 43 to 45, just in case you really are into this subject. And that said, please follow the show, share the episode, and leave us a review. Preferably one that says I handled 15 minutes of logistics with grace, intelligence, and only moderate emotional distress.
You did very well.
Thank you.
I have prepared a cargo allocation spreadsheet as your reward.
Every girl's dream. And that concludes episode 77 of Mill History Talk. Let's wrap things up before he starts explaining the columns.
Until next time, remember, armies may win battles, but they cannot fight overseas unless someone carries the war across the water.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mill History Talk.